Welcome back to the Sustainable Packaging Show, where we are on a journey to figure out the answer to this question: what is actually sustainable? And in today's show, let's talk about, are plastics more sustainable than you have been led to believe? There's so much about anti plastic nowadays. Everyone wants to ban plastics, ban plastics. What if there's another side to the story? Shouldn't you want to educate yourself on that side to the story? So I found a man that I've known and respected for a long time and asked him to be on the show to share his viewpoint. I'm very grateful. Steve Koenig is the director of business development for rigid packaging at Husky Technologies. For those of you who are not familiar, Husky Technologies recently celebrated 70 years as a leading global supplier of injection molding equipment with customers in over 140 countries, serving key markets in food and beverage packaging, consumer electronics, medical, pharmaceutical sectors. Their machinery is used to mold PET bottles for many of the biggest brands and consumers and products that you consume on a daily basis. Steve, thank you very much for being on the show. I want to make this case. Are plastics more sustainable than people have been led to believe? Let's just have a great conversation here. Thanks for being on the show.
Perfect. Michael, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to sharing my experience. And I think this is a great topic where we can have some very good discussion.
Absolutely. Mike, why are you having a guy from plastics on the Sustainable Packaging Show? Look, guys, this show is about sharing various perspectives. This is a man who's been in this business 34 years. I can promise you there's a lot to learn here. So, Steve, let's dive right into it. A lot of people, they are anti-plastic. They're calling for plastic bans. Just ban plastic altogether. And I like to be a little more thoughtful and say, okay, is that actually a good idea? Is that actually a practical idea? So, why is that potentially not a good idea to just ban plastics altogether?
Well, Michael, I think that's an emotional response. I think that's a knee-jerk reaction to what people are seeing in the media. When we look at plastic that's laying around on the ground, there's a lot of imagery around, it ended up in the ocean, which it is. And I think that as a society, we really haven't dealt with what do we do with end of life? How are we dealing with these materials? And if we talk about a ban, what if we banned glass? What if we banned aluminum? What is the alternative? All these materials we need, they actually serve a purpose, just as plastic serves a purpose. I think the detriment, yeah, there's a perfect example. If we look around the world, here in North America, we take for granted that water is just available, whether it's coming from our sink or bottled water, but in parts of the world, you just don't have access to clean drinking water. So that was
That's a great point. Great point.
but if we think about, just banning it because we don't know how to deal with end of life is a tremendous disservice, because plastic does have a part and to play. And if we talk about food packaging specific, and what we'll clarify during, our hour together here is its intent is really to preserve and to protect our food that we use today. And it does a great job at that because it's very cost effective. It's very material efficient. The problem is we haven't really associated any value to those packages. And in most cases, unlike glass and aluminum, where there's deposit return systems, it will either go into trash and people just don't think about it. And then, of course, it just ends up through into landfill, incineration, or in some places where they don't even have collection available, it just ends up in the ocean. So I think it's a very confusing time and people are very emotionally charged. But the reality is, there are technologies in place and it is a material that has value and we just need to think of it that way. So
We'll get into some of those technologies a little bit later. I think that's a very interesting point, that if plastic had a value tied to it, would people treat it differently? Do we just it's just, there's no value to it, and people are inherently lazy, at least to some degree? Or you could say lazy. Some people are just too busy, overwhelmed, whatever. I'm just going to dispose of the plastic, versus if there was a value, would people treat it uh, more appropriately? Do you think is that a viable idea that you guys think about?
yeah, and I'll give you an example, Michael. So I live here in Canada, and this is a $10 bill. It's purple and it's made of plastic.
Okay.
So I can do whatever I want with it. I can put it in the wash. I have been pressed very hard to find one of these on the ground. In fact, I've never
Interesting.
found a $10 bill on the ground. Why? Because there's a value. If someone sees a $10 bill on the ground, they're going to pick it up. We
Mhm.
don't think of plastic packaging the same way we do as money because there's no value associated to it. So people are very quick to discard something, but there really is a value, and it's understanding what that value is and having mechanisms in place so that we can couple of things. One is provide a place for people to return these valuable resources, whether it be through Blue Box or you return it to the place you've purchased it. Then there's the collection and reclaiming and resorting and reusing those materials over and over again, which they can. So I think, yes, as a society, whether it's not just the consumer, we can't put blame on the consumer. It's from EPR, it's from legislation. We have to do a mind change that it is worth something and we need to get it back.
So you're gonna get value from returning your plastic versus just doing the right thing by putting it in your blue bin is sort of one of the potential paths to improving the end of life problems that we're seeing with plastic. I was thinking as I was preparing for this, and we talked about this briefly, because the idea of a plastic ban, and I'm saying, okay, is that even a possibility? And we talked about this hospitals, the medical system. Like, what are the ramifications if really tomorrow legislation passed, plastic is banned? What are the cases where plastic has its place? So you get the medical system. Imagine a hospital, IV bags, medications, no plastic. Okay, maybe it's not a plastic ban. Maybe we need to be a little bit more thoughtful. Are there any other good cases or situations where you could point to saying like look, plastic is serving such an important function in this specific scenario. A plastic ban really would be a bad idea. Before we move on to the next question, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Great. So I can think of two great examples, and the first one you brought up is medical. So I'll stay with that medical example. You know, the medical industry has moved away from glass. Why? Because glass is breakable. And that can be a contaminant itself. But if we think of things like stents that people use, if they've had a heart attack or something, that is made from the same material that you just consumed your water from. It's called PET. And PET is a inert material. It's actually a wonder material, and it is used quite a bit exclusively in the medical industry. And that's one of the benefits of this material. It is inert and it doesn't have an impact. So for sure, banning it, that would be a backward step for the medical industry because they rely on plastics quite a bit. Another great example is, and Michael, how old are you roughly, if you don't mind?
I got to reveal my age. I guess I can always do that. I'm 37.
37. Okay. So this is probably going a little bit before your time, but if we go back to the mid 70s, the two largest cola producers out of the US were looking to expand their business by getting into multi-serve products. So if anyone, who's, I'm going to say 45, 50 years older, probably remembers big 2-liter glass bottles that they could buy from the grocery store. But the problem with those glass bottles was that if they fell off the shelf, they're a carbonated beverage. It created an explosion and glass was everywhere, and that was a hazard. And it was the invention of this PET, this wonder material that you see today that you're drinking from, that actually solved the problem. And it solved the problem actually in a number of ways. One is, if those bottles were to fall off the shelf, they weren't going to break and shatter and cause harm to people. But it was also a much more cost-effective material than using glass. And probably they didn't know it at the time, but when we look back, if we talk about carbon footprint, which is now a big um, indicator as to how we measure the health of the planet, the resources required to manufacture plastic versus glass is incredible. Keeping those furnaces running to produce glass is significantly higher than it would for plastic. Just, very simple. We need 1500 degrees centigrade for melting glass and sand down. If we talk about PET, you're down to 285 degrees Celsius. That's a big difference
Difference.
in the amount of energy
Different.
you're consuming. So those are two examples. So I think just banning it would be a step backwards. And I don't think people have really understood the impact of the carbon footprint if we had to go back to some other materials. So hygienic,
Very interesting.
cost, carbon footprint, I think those are all the reasons, back to your original question. You know, banning it is probably not the right idea. I think what we need to focus our attention on is collection and getting those materials back and reusing those materials.
Absolutely. Very, very interesting. The glass bottle is a great example of where it's maybe it's a little bit more pointed. And there's going to be people on the show that are all about a ban, and there's going to be people that say a ban is a horrible idea. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle where, okay, plastic, there's definite alternatives in these use cases, but over here, let's be honest and reflect in the good and the positivity. Think about what would happen if that glass bottle shatters and explodes everywhere. And I think that's why I'm a big fan of just thinking things through, listening to other perspectives. It's one of the things that I really try to
Right.
promote on the show. You mentioned EPR, just as a quick segment. Can you just give our viewers a refresher or an intro to the basics of EPR and what that movement is all about?
So EPR is the extended producer's responsibility. So what does that really mean? So the brands that are producing the package that is protecting the contents, which is really what they're trying to sell, so that you can enjoy that beverage or that food product. But as a responsibility, there's fees that they need to pay, and those fees are around collecting those packages back. So if there's blue boxes in certain states or in provinces, depending where you live, those are fees to help support collection and recycling. And that's how, in some areas, part of that money is raised so that we can get some of these materials back.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that. So, the good side of plastic that people don't consider, and we touched on this a little bit in the first in that first question, but anything else you'd like to add aside from the shelf life, aside from the durability of plastic not shattering? What's some of the good side of plastic that people might not consider when they evaluate it and they see the heartbreaking documentaries where they see the negatives? What's the good side that people might not be considering?
Well, I think the good side, and just top of mind, and we talked about carbon footprint. If we think, let's just take the auto industry as an example. Um, you know, more and more you see plastic in your car today, and what are the benefits of that? Why does that happen? If we think about trying to have fuel efficient vehicles, making a car lighter, and making a car lighter via these plastics is one way that as a consumer, you get better fuel efficiency. So what's the benefit of that? Well, we're using less fossil fuel for our oil or petrol, and therefore there's a significant benefit. That's how you're getting more miles, more kilometers out of your car per liter or per gallon. That, to me, is one of the biggest benefits I don't think people recognize, that
Very interesting.
the more we can lightweight things, the more efficient we are with those materials. And in some cases, some of those materials can actually be stronger. Uh,
So can I just jump in for a sec? So on one hand, you could say, "Oh my gosh, this is so horrible. That brand's using plastic. They don't care about the planet." But there's this back end that says, in this car example, how much fossil fuel reduction comes because you were able to lightweight using plastic. It's a very it just shows how multidimensional sustainability can be, and you got to sort of think it through to really understand it, and then you can make your own choice on what path you wanna go down.
yeah. And I think, if we talk about plastics and why they were invented, is or the uses of them, it's a cost efficient way with a lower CO2 footprint than the alternative. I think the dilemma or the contradiction that exists today is nobody ever gave proper thought to what happens at end of life. And when I say end of life, I mean from the consumer's perspective. How
Mhm.
are we dealing with these materials? And that's really the challenge that we're faced with today, because they are ending up in places that are unintended in the environment. But again, these materials do have value, and we just need to bring them back, because there are technologies where we can reuse these materials and we can reuse them over and over again. And if we have that infrastructure in place, then there is no need to continue drilling for oil and fabricating more. I mean, there will probably always be a need, to top it up as we grow as a population. But
Mhm.
there's more than enough materials that we've extracted from the planet that we just need to reuse them. And I can actually give a shout out. There's one water bottling company very close to us. They're vertically integrated as a recycler. They have not used virgin plastic material in over 12 years. They are actually getting all the blue box material back, and they are repurposing that material, and they're using it over and over and over again. So they are
Wow.
steward of circularity.
So how do they collect in that example? So they're not relying on the traditional blue bin PCR system, or have they just been buying PCR? How do they achieve that?
So it's a combination of both. So where this company exists and where I live, so I live in Ontario province,
Mhm.
and in Ontario there is a blue box system, so curbside. So as you're finished with your products, it goes into the blue box, and they work with the MRFs and they buy that material back as a bale, and they're consuming all of that PET from the bale, and they're reprocessing it and they're putting it back into their bottles that they're using for spring water.
Got it. One of the things that I've thought about, before moving to the next question on the good side of plastics, again, because the bad side, we've all seen it. So can we look at this more well-rounded? And I was doing some research and I came across something that said, used the example of, piano keys. And piano keys, this is sort of like a classic, maybe this is like a 101, but I'll share it anyways. Piano keys used to be made from,
I agree.
elephant tusks?
Correct.
And that got converted to largely being made from plastic today. So if you think about plastics bad, yes, but think about that's arguably a bigger disaster, killing elephants and using their tusks or harming elephants. I don't know if you'd probably kill them in the process. So think about ways that plastics have had a positive impact and not just a negative, just so you see things accurately and well rounded. Steve, do you recognize that plastic pollution is a problem that needs to be solved? I think sometimes people in the plastics industry, and you also your company makes equipment for injection molding. You're not a plastic resin supplier. I want to just put that out there. So Steve could make his machines could make things out of bioplastics too. So I think he's a little more objective. But sometimes the plastics industry gets a reputation of being out of touch or, not really recognizing that this is a problem. So if I were to ask you that question, do you recognize plastic pollution as a problem that needs to be solved? How do you answer that?
Wholeheartedly. Absolutely. Um, you know, Plastics belong in the economy. They don't belong in the environment. And our organization, as you'd mentioned, we are an equipment supplier, and and we participate in a number of organizations. We participate in collaboration with brands. We participate with retailers, and we're really focused on sustainability because we do believe that plastics have a place. We do believe that compared to the alternatives, they have the lowest carbon footprint from an energy resource. I think what we keep getting to, and Michael, when we talk about bad, we just haven't, the industry has not come together as a collective union to get these materials back and to deal with them. Now, does that mean we're not doing anything? Absolutely not. The industry, and Husky being one of the leaders, is actually pulling a lot of these industries together. So we do have a collective voice, because today it is very fragmented between the producers, between the equipment suppliers, between legislation from country to country.
Right.
No one person owns it. And this is generally the challenge. If no one person owns it, how do you move it forward? Who deals with it? Because what happens is, who's going to pay for it? So until there's shared responsibility and shared benefits of the return of those materials, you know, it comes through a lot of collaboration and willingness for people to do what they want to do is the right thing. So yes, to answer your question, we don't believe plastics belong in the environment, and we want to be a steward, a leader, an advocacy for helping this industry and getting those materials back. And those are some of the things that we do, Michael.
Appreciate that. I appreciate how directly you answered the question too, as opposed to some people, oh, they waver around every which way. You guys are very principled. And I think there's so many places we can go with this conversation. I'm excited to dig in a little deeper here. It seems to me that there's kind of two paths environmentally as you're talking. There's the avoid plastic, get away from plastic. And then there's the what you guys are leading. How do we process plastics better at the end of life? So let's go into that as the next question. Tell me about new technologies, improvements to infrastructure that can actually, because what you're saying makes sense. Yes, if we can process them better, hey, I think people would be open to that. But when is that going to come? Is that ever going to come? So, new technologies, talk about advanced recycling, also sometimes called chemical recycling or molecular recycling. What new technologies are really coming out to get our audience excited that help really is on the way?
Perfect. So I think there's two elements to that question, and it's always the chicken and the egg scenario.
Right.
So if we talk about making investments to recycle these materials, number one is you have to have enough of the material coming back. So if there aren't collection um, processes in place, how are we going to get those materials? Trying to make a viable business run if you can't get that material back, is part of the first challenge. Now, assuming those things are all taken care of, and we can talk about high concentration, high population places like New York, Chicago, um, places like that where it's very easy to get the volume of those materials. Then people make investments. So what I'm super excited about is when we talk about recycling today, we've mostly focused on what's called mechanical recycling. And mechanical recycling is where you would take a bottle, you chop it up, and you clean it, and you melt it down, and you reprocess it. The challenge with mechanical recycling is, um, you know, most people are looking for clear bottles, and with mechanical recycling, if you had a bottle, and this is a plastic beer bottle,
Mhm.
now if you were to put these two in the same mechanical stream, well, this color from this amber bottle is going to impact this clear bottle.
Understood.
And and you
Thanks
know,
for the visual. It's pretty good. If you're just listening, we'll post the video as well.
so when we talk about mechanical recycling, people are trying to protect the clear stream as much as possible because that holds the most value and it goes back into a clear bottle. But what I'm super excited about, and we talked about advanced recycling and molecular recycling, is these difficult, I'm going to say, colors, opaques, so home and personal care. These most MRFs and recyclers want to separate out because they don't want them to contaminate the clear recycle stream. But advanced recycling is able to take all these what we call difficult to recycle materials, all these colored, these opaques, and it essentially is unzipping the molecular chains back into their monomers. So what does that mean? I'm going to try and make it a little bit simpler. If you were a baker and you were making a cake, you would want to use eggs, flour, sugar, a few other ingredients, and you would make your cake. That cake would then, let's say, get all ground up and recycled, and you can make other cakes. You could have oatmeal, you could have cherry cake, but you're going to put that all back together, and it's just going to be whatever those combination of that feedstock is. If we talk about chemical recycling, it's now taking that cake and it's breaking it back down into its raw components, back into the eggs, back into the sugar, back into the flour. And therefore, when we take those raw components, we can reformulate them to now make cookies or a different flavor cake.
Wow. Okay.
Actually, the beauty of chemical recycling, and I'm also super excited that there's an installation that's opening up this month. It's from Eastman Chemical out of Kingsport, Tennessee. They're doing their official launch in, I think, March or April of 2024. But this is the first one in the US. And we're super excited because now this is going to add to the capability of recycling to increase the amount of recycled material. So we're going to stop those materials from going to landfill or to incineration because they're considered undesirable. Now we can reprocess them and we can turn them back into products that we love. And from a brand's perspective, color is super important.
Absolutely.
If we think about home and personal care or um, packaging is how colors is how we connect with our consumers. The brands need that ability to connect and differentiate themselves. So if we wanted to say strip out all the colors and just go to clear, well, those are very boring packages. And color
Mhm.
is need, and that's why I'm so super excited that this technology is coming on board. And like I said, the industry is making progress. It's just a matter of we need time to deal with that, but there are technologies to deal with it.
Sounds like an amazing uh, advancement. So you literally, I like the analogy, you're almost reversing from the cake back into the raw ingredients
Correct.
to allow. So still collecting through the blue bin, curbside recycling. It's just when it reaches the MRF, now there's going to be more usable material rather than a lot of that material going to the MRF and being discarded or incinerated. Now those colored plastics will be more useful, and this whole idea of recycling will be more successful. Am I understanding correctly?
That is correct. That is correct.
Yeah, because you hear a lot of people saying recycling is dead, recycling is dead, recycling is dead. And I say there's issues with recycling, but let's not say that because that can discourage people from even trying, right? Maybe recycling is dead. Why am I even going to try? Let me just, throw it in the trash. So I try to tell people not to say things like that. Recycling needs improvement, and this perhaps is a wonderful improvement. So shout out to Eastman for the great work they're doing.
Correct.
Um, where so this is in Tennessee. Will this do you think this plant will how far out will this will the collections how big of an impact will this have? Will it be the whole state of Tennessee? Will it be neighboring states, or is it just a certain city? Any gauge on that?
Yeah, so when I last spoke with their representative, I asked that specific question because there becomes a logistics challenge. You're not going to be trucking garbage. Well, I shouldn't use the word garbage. Blue box material from, let's just say, California all the way over to Tennessee. That just does not make sense. But what he did tell me is it would be about a 350-mile radius from Kingsport, Tennessee. So they would be taking materials all within that distance so that they could process that material.
So 350. That's a lot. We're in Rhode Island, so that would practically the smallest state, small but powerful, would be
Correct.
covering a lot of land there. So 350. So that's not bad. And these operations, we're looking $1 billion plus to get off the ground at least right now. So this is not a small investment.
Correct.
But with the way government tends to spend money, maybe it wouldn't be the worst investment in the world, right? To be able to solve some of these problems, it might be another path to resolve these issues. Let's move. Anything else on this topic before we move to another one?
Yeah, the only other comment is, they're not the only ones that are making investments in molecular recycling technology. What I
Mhm.
can say for them is they have a plan. So their first facility I just mentioned is Kingsport, Tennessee. They have another installation that's going over in Europe. I believe it's in France. And then their third installation will be out of Texas, I think out of Houston. And I think that's slated for 2026, I think. So they have a roadmap where they're going to be implementing more. So again, super exciting, and it's adding more capacity for recycling, especially the difficult to recycle packages, which include color. So
Hard
now,
to recycle items. Okay, excellent. Um, let's go in now to take a second there. Okay, let's go now into the conversation of greenhouse gases. One of the things I've been talking about on previous episodes is I've been diving more into some of our larger clients requesting life cycle assessments, scope one, scope two, scope three, really digging into numbers to meet their ESG standards, and a lot of them choosing plastic, right? A lot of people don't like to hear that, but a lot of these larger companies choosing plastic, post consumer recycled plastic as their sustainability path. And the way that I think about it is you sort of have a fork in the road
Mhm.
where sometimes you need to choose between other environmental stressors like greenhouse gas emissions, like water consumption, and what I call pollution potential, because as we stand today, there is a lot of plastic pollution. We can't deny that.
Correct.
But I think we need to talk about the positive side as well, just to paint that picture for people. So, statistically, is it an accurate statement to say that a PET water bottle in manufacturing is going to have less greenhouse gas emissions, let's just say carbon dioxide, but there's others, than alternatives like the aluminum bottle or like a paper carton? Um, is that a fair statement across the board, or would you say that's in maybe an overgeneralization?
No, I believe that to be completely fair. And, you referred to LCA's life cycle analysis. When we look at carbon footprint, if you compare it to aluminum or glass, aluminum is about 4.2 times greater impact on CO2 footprint than it is over PET. And if we look at glass, it's about 4.5 times greater. And that really comes down to the energy required to convert those materials into the final package. So if we think about aluminum, aluminum has to be mined out of the planet. So there's a significant footprint to mine that, and then you have to refine it. And there's a lot of energy that's required to refine those materials into the feedstock that's used for aluminum and glass.
Right.
Same. And yes, plastic and PET comes from oil. So yes, there's definitely a carbon footprint too. But the energy that's used to make it is significantly lower than you would see from aluminum and glass.
It's a very interesting way of looking into it as you peel back the layers of the onion, right? There's always more to learn because a lot of brands, and I've seen press releases. I actually did a show. I was featuring a press release and I was talking and I was almost feeling like I was ragging on the company. So I didn't post that segment. But they said, we have now moved to aluminum packaging to reduce our carbon footprint and get away from fossil based plastics or something to the sort. And a lot of people don't recognize that there's a lot of fossil fuels being burned to get the aluminum, to get the glass. It's not just, hey, plastic comes from fossil fuels at its core, therefore that's the fossil fuel option, but the other ones are completely free from fossil fuels. It's an interesting thought. My next question would be when we're calculating the impact or the greenhouse gas emissions related to plastics, are we considering the whole process, meaning drilling for the crude oil? Can you actually walk us through that process and then just clarify, are we just saying it's more efficient in the manufacturing of the bottle, or do we really look from beginning to end, cradle to grave or cradle to cradle, as some would say? Um, are we looking at the whole picture?
So great question. And I am not an LCA expert, but what I can tell you is, an LCA is there to assess one item versus another item. And there is a process in place as to how to do that. Now, where things can sometimes be a little bit interesting is, and you sort of described it as, what is really the start and where is the end? And those are the boundaries that sometimes define it. And when we look at these boundaries, if we talk about even regionally or globally where these boundaries happen, and I'll give you an example. When we talk about energy sources, so up in the Northeast, there's a lot of hydro that takes place. So hydro is your energy source, which is very low on the carbon footprint. But if you're in a region that is still using fossil fuels to produce electricity, that has a negative impact, and therefore that can throw the LCA out very much. So you have to be careful when looking at LCAs. It's not like there's an answer and this is the holy grail. It's more of a number of LCAs. It's kind of like medical papers, as an example. You'll have a different number of practitioners that will write about a topic, and it's the theme between the LCA that you have to look at. And we've had a number of LCAs. There's probably about 7. They've been posted. You can find them on the internet. And, when we looked at some of the big ones, and even from some of the aluminum companies, In most cases, they've always said PET has the lowest carbon footprint when it comes to packaging materials versus aluminum.
Interesting. Interesting. I think people are just so hungry to quantify sustainability that there's like this LCA craze, but I do see what you say that there are shortcomings, and I think an LCA is, in my personal opinion, a tool, not the only tool,
Correct.
because you need this sort of critical thinking.
That's
Plastic,
in the example I'm trying to make too, that,
yeah.
if collection just doesn't exist, like maybe in the Midwest, Midwest is miles and miles and miles and people are spread out, maybe their only option is to go to landfill as an example. I'm not suggesting that's the right thing to do, but
Mhm.
those are the difference between a highly dense populated area like New York or Chicago or LA versus being somewhere out in the Midwest where, it's miles and miles between homes and you're
Right.
really to take to landfill. So those are things that you always have to consider when
Or
looking.
countries with no infrastructure, right? No recycling. We take for granted in North America that we have these things.
Correct.
Many places, there's no I that hit me a couple of years ago. There's no recycling. The idea of recycling is so far down on the list when food and water are your biggest problems. So we have certain benefit to even think about these things, to be honest,
Absolutely.
and a certain responsibility to resolve them. So one thing I want to share before we get into the final segment. Time flies when you're having fun. We're moving right along, Steve. Thank you again for this. This is wonderful.
No problem.
Plastics, the production of plastics. I heard in my research, or I read that plastics are a byproduct of the uh, the oil drilling process. Maybe you can state it better that we're not drilling for oil and then just exclusively using that for plastic, but rather we're drilling for oil. There's certain byproducts in that drilling process that can then be used for plastics and other things as well. Can you talk about that? Because that might be, I think that's another fact that needs to be considered in this discussion.
Absolutely. Now, I'm not an expert in this field either, but if we think about drilling for crude oil and, everything is starting from crude and crude is holding, I'm going to say all the ingredients of what we need for gasoline production. However, when we talk about refining for gasoline, they're extracting, let's call the ingredients that they want to make petrol. And then there's still stuff that's left remaining. The stuff that's left remaining in combination with some other, um, I don't like to use the word byproducts, but with the chemicals, they're using those for other opportunities. Those opportunities are for plastics. So, are we drilling specifically for plastics? No, we're not. Are we consuming part of the crude oil for plastics? Absolutely, we are. But
Okay,
main focus really is theirs for energy, for oil and diesel and gasoline.
got it. Okay, thank you. Good learning point for a lot of people, I'm sure there. So let's talk about recycling and collections for a moment. There's a statistic that comes out, and it's been widely published that only 9% of plastics are recycled. And then after that, they're going to show images of wildlife entangled in plastic, and it's painting a picture that recycling is broken. And that means 91% of plastics are in the environment, are in the landfill, are being incinerated, are in our oceans. I wanna ask you, is that a fair statistic, in your opinion? Do you think that's an accurate statistic, or is that a statistic that maybe makes it look worse than it is? I'm not sure it makes it look better, but is that a fair statistic? I'll just ask that question.
Yeah, so the people that I've been speaking with, and I looked into that 9% number. I mean, globally, um, yes, it feels to be accurate, but where sometimes the challenge is we use the word plastics, and plastics itself is a very generic word.
Right.
Um, if I don't know if this can be seen properly here, but if we talk about plastics, there's 7 material codes, and these material codes can be found on the bottom of your bottle. And what it is meant to do is define, well, what type of plastic are we dealing with? And today that 9% is including a 1, which is PET, all the way through to 7, and 7 is other.
Right.
If you focus in on one of those material code, and I'll focus on PET as an example, because that's, back to the bottle or water bottle example. In the US alone, they're achieving about 30% collection and recycling rate. So of that 30% in the US is specific to PET. So depending on what you're trying to do with the number, um, you know, again, if you can't measure something, how do you know where you are and how can you improve? So I guess that
Right.
any number is always a good. The result of the number is bad when you say 9%, but all
Right.
it means is there's upside, and there are
Absolutely.
available for upside, and I think we need to address that. And again, which material code are you really talking about? We need to deal with certain materials. They say they may be recyclable, but are they recycled? Not all recyclers can handle all materials, so that itself is another problem. But again, can't make improvements if you don't measure yourself. So I'm a believer of measuring.
Absolutely. Yeah, I am too. I think we need to quantify, okay, 9%, but it's like, okay, what does that really mean? Like nowadays there's statistics, you got to really peel back and say, okay, you can't just take a number at face value. And I think you brought up a lot of good points there that the country that you're in, so maybe if we just look at US, maybe that 9 number is not so bad. Not that we should just blindly produce plastics, but maybe it's not so bad. The choice of the resin could further improve that number.
Absolutely.
Maybe if it's PET and only PET, maybe the number would be higher. And then the third one I was thinking as you were saying is the packaging format could be an impact as well. So flexible packaging, which is historically either unrecyclable or even if it's monomaterial, extremely difficult to recycle. You got to go to the store drop off. Who really has the time to do that in today's crazy busy world? So if that could further reduce the number to a 9%. So if we said, I'm selling a product in the US and Canada, and I'm going to use PET as a resin, and it's going to be an injection molded format that's curbside recyclable, perhaps that number would be a lot higher than the 9% that we hear.
Correct. And you brought up a good point. So in Mexico, as an example, um, they have a circularity law, and you brought up flexibles. So flexibles today are multi-material laminated pouches that
Mhm.
are not recyclable, and they've implemented law that they need um, certain percentage of recycled content into these packages, which they can't achieve. So a lot of the flexibles are actually moving to rigid, and they're moving to PET just because of that reason alone. It is a material of choice that there is an infrastructure in place. And in Mexico, they have a lot of hand pickers, people that are picking this material because their livelihoods are coming from there, and they're getting paid to get these materials. So that's an example of where things are working. The other, just to touch on it, we talked about 9% and 30%. I'll take it to another extreme. Germany. Germany has a deposit system in place for their PT packaging. They're hitting 95 plus on their collection and recycling rates. So again, it
95
95, and it's actually probably a little bit higher, but that's the number that you can find posted be
across the board or just on the plastic, Steve?
on PET,
On PET. Wow, 95.
because there is a deposit system in place and there's an infrastructure in place so they can get those bottles back. So
Interesting.
So it is doable. And again, one of the benefits of being a global company is we do have visibility to see what's going on in other parts of the world. The real question is, how can we make a business case that we can lift and shift those technologies, those infrastructures, those business models so that everybody could benefit from it? So it is very possible.
I wonder if this could be a pilot in a certain state. You could say the US population is so much bigger than Germany. That's why it's easier to do in Germany. But why not pilot it in one state and then see how that works and then scale from there? That could be a possible way to go about this.
That would
Um,
be fantastic. And it also comes down to legislation. Is
yeah,
legislation going to say, there's going to be a a deposit system in place?
interesting. Interesting. Yes, absolutely. So, um, let's talk about recyclable. I want to dive more into that Mexico thing, but I don't know if we're gonna have time. So maybe at the end, I'm curious to learn more about that. So, recyclable. What is recyclable? This word. Oh, it's recyclable. The old school way was let me throw a chasing arrows on it. Let me make consumers think it's eco-friendly, and I don't really care what happens. Okay, there's the old school thinking. No one would actually have that thought process, right, Steve? But a lot of people did. Okay. The new way of thinking is what is actually going to happen? Is it actually going to be processed by the MRF? So when I think of recyclability, I think of can the MRF handle it? And is there an actual demand for it if the MRF can handle it? Anything that I'm missing or anything else you would add to that sort of thinking on what is recyclable?
So I think you hit the nail on the head because, the plastics are recyclable, but the question is, are they recycled? And in many cases, the answer is no. And you sit here and say, well, then why are there chasing arrows on it? Well, this is the part of the confusing part about it. The the chasing arrows were implemented after the number codes. The number codes are 1 through 7. And the 1 through 7 is really to identify what is the material. Am I dealing with PET? Am I dealing with polypropylene? Am I dealing with PVC? Then, yes, it's recyclable, but the question is it recycled? And in many cases, the answer is no, because of a couple of reasons. One is there's not enough demand or volume to capture some of those materials, so nobody's buying it. And if there's no demand, why am I going to produce it? And therefore, it goes to landfill or incineration. And, it's back to that chicken and egg scenario. And that's kind of why we are working with some of the larger brands, specifically in home and personal care. If they would invest in buying some of these materials that aren't clear, then yeah, a lot of those materials would have a home. So recycled or recyclable and recycled are really two different fundamental activities that take place.
Right.
Most
Would you
people obviously don't know that.
Yeah, would you consider it's a very valid point. I always saw number 7 plastics with the chasing arrows kind of as greenwashing because that's yes, is it recycling in some possible world where there's a dedicated stream for other? But I say that's really not practically happening.
Correct.
Feel free to disagree with me. Is that a fair assessment? Am I missing something there? Or is that kind of that really shouldn't have a chasing arrows on it?
So in principle, I would agree. I mean, maybe there is something somewhere. I mean, I don't know everything in all places, but in general, I would agree. 7 is just meant to capture all the other stuff.
Right.
Is that stuff repurposed somehow? Maybe it is. I'm not that close to it, but it's highly unlikely.
Right, and then people just see the chasing arrows, throw it in their blue bin. Now they're adding contamination to the recycling stream. They're just making things worse. It would be better they throw it in their trash. So it's, that's the kind of stuff we really need to get out of this, or stop doing, or
Yeah.
stop doing.
I mean, you want to make it easy for the consumer, right? And
Mm,
you want to create habits. So if now you're telling a consumer, well, I want this one and not that one, it becomes very consuming. I think at the end of the day, we do
right,
want to build habits for the consumer that, hey, if we have these plastics, put it in the same place so it builds proper habits. Then, the MRFs and recycling companies, they can have sorting technologies where they can deal with it. We just need to have those technologies that we can actually repurpose them. But I don't want to make too many bins for a person to put out on their curb. We already have blue, we have green.
no, no, no. We don't need any more bins. We gotta keep things, achievable for people.
Exactly.
So, as far as, uh, what what types of plastic recyclers want or MRFs want or MRFs can process, let's say. Are there certain I know you said clear plastics are most desirable.
Clear and green.
Clear and green plastics, like green clear plastics, like a Perrier bottle or like a opaque what would be an example of a green
Yeah,
plastic bottle?
is a good example.
Okay.
So a lot of that material, it doesn't necessarily go back bottle to bottle, but there are other industries such as fibers, strapping, carpeting. They will use those materials. Um, Ultimately, we would like to get those. We don't want those bottles necessarily to be downcycled. We want them to come back around to become bottles again, because now you're taking away from the feedstock. But
Sure.
traditionally, through mechanical recycling, that's kind of where they end up. We're hoping now with molecular recycling or chemical recycling, now we can break those, we can pull the green out, and we can bring those back. So if people do want to use them for clear bottles, they can.
Interesting. So molecular offers the potential promise that downcycling will be less frequent and you
Correct.
can actually turn bottles into bottles, which is the original idea. How
Exactly.
about little pieces like caps? I've read that research that caps sometimes fall through belt systems and that this would be difficult, even if it's made out of PET, which is a desirable resin, that if it's not screwed onto the bottle, this little thing's gonna get lost. Is that a hard and fast rule across the board, or does that only apply to a handful of MRFs that I've connected with?
So actually, I wish I had brought some examples because what you brought up is a great topic because in Europe, they are passing legislation that as of July 2024, all beverage containers, 3 liters and under, have to have the closure tethered to the bottle.
Wow.
So there's a little mechanism that, it's kind of like a sport cap. If you could imagine, it flips open, the cap stays on. And again, that is so that the consumer is not throwing them away. And at the same time, when it goes to the mechanical recycling, it will stay with the bottle. It will get all chopped up. And in the mechanical recycling process, there's something called a sink float tank. So the cap that you just described is made from HDPE. Those are polyolefins. They will float. So they come to the top of the tank and the PET sinks down to the bottom. And that's how they separate those two materials. So both are very valuable materials and they do want them back. When they're separated from each other, the recycling companies, they have screens. I think they're 2 by 2 inches. If they're not attached, those caps would fall through and they just get mixed in with all the other, probably go to landfill. So yes, we do want the closure back on the bottle. And yes, that is material that we can reuse and recycle.
Excellent. Excellent. So as we wrap up here, a few final questions. Do you see a world where petroleum plastics eventually get phased out completely? And if so, by when?
Yeah. I, I mean, trying to be a bit of a realist here, I think the answer is no. Um, if we just think about that the population continues to grow, but let me answer it differently. You know, I mentioned the comment earlier that there's enough plastic out there today that if we could collect it all, we could bring it back and make new bottles. The problem or the challenge is that as the population continues to grow, there's still going to be a need for adding more plastic. Now, whether that plastic is bio-based versus a fossil fuel feedstock could be questionable, but I mean, we're really talking years and years out. So I don't see within the foreseeable future, and when I say foreseeable, within the next 25 years, if the answer is no, I don't think so.
Yeah, maybe it's specific. This could also apply to any legislator or regulators that are thinking about what's the right laws to write.
Correct.
Maybe it's certain items. Maybe take out food service. You can think about reducing plastics, but a blanket plastic ban, it seems like we're not gonna have time to talk about it, but that example with Mexico, maybe the infrastructure wasn't there. So if you make a decision to make a ban, are you gonna make things not feasible for businesses to operate in? This is just another consideration. Steve, this has been wonderful. Any closing remarks? I have one last question to close, but anything else that you think would be valuable for listeners? Again, to share a different perspective. You're not all gonna agree with Steve. Some of you just dislike plastic, and I welcome that, and I respect everyone's opinions. But this is another perspective. You have to listen to these points. This man's been in the business 34 years. That's quite a track record, and there's a lot to learn. Steve, anything else to just paint the full factual picture of what we're dealing with, not the emotional picture? What anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Yeah. So, Michael, thanks. First of all, thank you for inviting me. This has been a fantastic discussion. I think, what I would just like to leave on is that, plastics do fulfill a need, which is around product protection. They are material efficient, meaning we can use very the least amount of material to protect that package. They're very cost efficient. I think what we're faced with in today's day and age is we just need to give proper thought and courtesy to how do we collect these materials back and reuse them so they're not in the environment. And I think that's really the challenge for this generation of people that, we need to start dealing with. And, as a leader, as a company who's a leader in this space, I'm very proud to sit here and say, yeah, we're a we help the plastics industry, but we don't just help to put more out. We're helping to meet sustainability commitments, and we're working on technologies. You mentioned PET closure. We're actually developing a PET closure, so it is single stream to go forward. So my comments there, I think there's a tremendous future ahead. I think plastics are here to stay. I think we just need to give it more thought and consideration on how to be effective on using the material and how to get that material back.
There you have it from the man himself. Very thoughtful, very pointed, very educational. And I think that's going to open a lot of minds. And that's what I want to do on this show, get people to listen to different perspectives. Then they can choose the impact that they want to make on the planet. As long as you're thoughtful, as long as you actually care, I'm a big supporter of what you're doing. And I appreciate you, Steve, being on the show. So
My
thank
pleasure.
you very much. Take care, man. Bye bye.
Thank you very much.